Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me for this session of Straight Chablis. My name is Maymata Aliyah. I'm a New York-based wine educator. And today our discussion is about the Chablis appellation, which is the largest and most likely the most widely recognized appellation in the Chablis region. It represents about close to 70%, it's exactly 66% of the wine that's produced in the region. And I think for most people, I know for most wine students, when we start to learn about Chablis, maybe one of the first big words we learn in wine speak is Kimmeridgian soils. And we feel very, very fancy with that word. And so we all kind of correlate Kimmeridgian soils with Chablis, and then we say check and we move on. But the reality of Chablis is that it is a fairly complex wine region, not to be painted with a monolithic brush. So despite the presence of Kimmeridgian soils, there's a lot of complexity to the Kimmeridgian soils, to their exposure of the vineyards, to the elevation. And so really there is a lot more nuance even to the wines of Chablis. You can have everything from wines that are very lean, very crisp, very sharp, to wines that are quite fleshy and robust. Of course, we also have variations in vintages. So with that in mind, what we will be doing today is to really try to shed a light on some of those nuances of the Chablis region. And to help me flesh out that discussion, I have the wonderful Chris Struck, who will be introducing himself in a few minutes. And we will also be tasting 3 wines together from 3 different producers. We have 2 different vintages that we'll be tasting from the 2019 and the 2018. So we can also kind of talk a little bit about some of those vintage variations. But before we delve into our discussion, I'd like to just turn the floor over to you, Chris, and give you a chance to tell us a little bit about yourself, what you've been up to, and anything else you want to share with us.
Thanks so much, May. I appreciate you having me on to chat Chablis today. I got my start in New York restaurants at Racine, New York. I was on the opening team there for a little over a year and a half before leaving to join the opening team at Danny Meyer's Union Square Cafe in its new location. And after that, COVID, but then landed as current beverage director of a Lebanese restaurant in New York called Ilili, growing restaurant group. And it's been very fun and unique and challenging working at each of those 3 restaurants in Manhattan, because the clientele are very different. The cuisines are very different and the beverage programs are very different. And so it's really been a very deep and wide education for me at each of those places in terms of talking about wine, approaching wine, selling wine, serving wine, and of course, pairing it with foods. So yeah, excited to bring that discussion to Chablis.
Great, thank you. And full disclosure, I am Lebanese. And so when I found out that you were at Ilili, I was super excited. I also do think that the wines of Chablis do pair very well with Lebanese cuisine, which is very reliant on a lot of, lemon and olive oil and garlic. I call it the holy trio in Lebanese cuisine. So I find that the wines of Chablis actually do pair beautifully with that. But as I said, we're going to talk a little bit more about some fun stuff and food pairings when we taste the wines. So I wanted to just kick this off by giving a bit of an overview of the Chablis appellation. And with that, I'm going to use my handy dandy map because I love maps. I'm a total map nerd, but I also think that it does give you a great sense of what a region looks like. So here's our Chablis wine region. And over here in the dark is the Grand Cru slope. And then some of those darker orange are some of those Premier Crus that are distributed on both sides of the Seine River, which pretty much kind of slices through the wine region. But then you'll see all of the yellow is the Chablis appellation. So as I mentioned, it is 66%, close to 70% of the wines produced in Chablis are of that appellation, the Chablis appellation. But what's also interesting, I'm going to kind of turn that sideways so people can see that, but there is a fair amount of diversity in this terrain. We're not talking about a flat area. We're also talking about a lot of variation in exposure and orientation. So you've got this river cutting through, and then you've got some of these kind of narrow valleys. You do have some of the, different elevations where some of the vines are planted a little bit closer to the plateaus. All of the vineyards on the plateaus go into the Petit Chablis appellation, which is a separate discussion. But before you get to that plateau, we are talking about a lot of diversity as well in the Camaragian soils. So Camaragian soils are basically what really distinguishes them is they're very complex soils with limestone and marl and clay, but most importantly, a very high presence of oyster fossils. And that's what really, a lot of people will say, brings that minerality to the wines of Chablis. So that, the presence of the fossils, the the amount of clay, the amount of limestone, the exposure, the depth, all of that brings also a fair amount of diversity. And as I mentioned, the hand of the winemaker, right? So typically in Chablis, we talk about wines that are, and I'm going to broad stroke it here, fermented in stainless steel. Generally, we don't have any new oak influences, especially for the Chablis wines. And typically, the most common winemaking tool you may find is the use of lees, whether the wines are aged on the lees for shorter periods of time, longer periods of time, if there's any lee stirring or batonnage that's going on. Those are probably some of the biggest winemaking differences that you'll find. Some people are using inoculated yeast, some people are using indigenous yeast. So again, that's going to bring a little bit of diversity. So within that discussion, as I mentioned, to you, Chris, what we wanted to do with this conversation is to talk a little bit about this diversity and sort of, I think a lot of times, sometimes this diversity gets a little bit lost in the discussion when it comes to Chablis. Do you think that people kind of have an understanding that there is this range of diversity, or do you think people tend to look at it as in a more sort of monolithic way?
No, I think the folly of many of us that study wine is there's so much in the wine world to study, and it's so overwhelming that unless you're, going deep and compartmentalizing and really just focusing on an in-depth dive, you get lost after the buzzwords, right? Camaragian soil,
Yeah.
very, very northerly growing area. You get the grapes down, you get the classic producers down, stainless steel. Great, let's move on to another region. Yeah. And Lord knows, Chablis being a part of Burgundy, it's one of the most nuanced wine regions in the world. So when you hold up that map, and I also absolutely love maps, it speaks volumes because of all of the world's regions. It's too easy to just like, yeah, I know about Chablis, I know about XYZ, but it makes sense. I mean, based on just what you learn as the basics of wine in terms of what's important in the vineyards, all of that exists very much in Chablis, and they have so many years of tradition of honing that and understanding that, and delineating what sites offer what. Talking about best sites without the qualifier of for what is like talking about best or worst vintages, right? You and I have discussed previously the problem with saying this is a good vintage or a bad vintage. Well, why? Was it an easy vintage on the grower, in which case that has nothing to do with the end consumer, because a very talented grower can deal with whatever nature gives them, assuming they don't lose their fruit entirely, and still make a solid wine that's worthy of putting their name on. It may not be as fresh in terms of acidity. It may not be as whatever thing that the grower wanted, because it wasn't an ideal condition climactically, but that's what you sign up for when you consume an agricultural product. It's subject to the variances of nature. And that's something that we don't celebrate enough when we consume wine or food, for that matter. We want, we know we love this producer, and we know we love this grape, we know we love this place. And yet when naturally, quite literally, they taste different from year to year, where, we don't factor in the natural holistic aspect of the experience. And we should only want consistency to a certain degree that nature allows. So, yes. And it's exciting. We have two different vintages here today, and seeing the similarities and differences between the two with such similar winemaking between the three examples that we have in the glass. It's, especially given the vintages and context of some of the ones that came immediately before them. It's Chablis is very much a unique place, and I don't think that people understand the nuances of the topography and the aspect and really elevation. Again, when you think about wine regions of elevation in the world, Chablis doesn't rank among the top, but that certainly doesn't mean it's just a bunch of, flat space. It's hilly, and hills can be big hills, little hills, and all of that makes a difference.
No, 100%. And when we were talking about this, I mean, I'm going to bring that map up again, because what's kind of, I mean, to be fair, there are some of the bigger wineries that are blending from the entire region. So for example, they may have some, they may be blending from vineyards on the right bank and the left bank and different elevations. But if you're one of the smaller growers, then you are very much going to be planting, blending from your own sites. And if you are, down here in one of the valleys where most of your vineyards are north facing, you're going to have a very, very different expression of style than if you were sourcing your grapes from, let's say, over here on the right bank, where you have a lot of southwest facing sites. And that's going to give you a very different expression of your vines as well. So, I think some of this diversity, and at one point when you and I were speaking and you said Chablis is one of those classic wine regions that's been around. And sometimes, you walk into a store, you see, maybe 10, 15 different bottles of Chablis lined up on a shelf. And I remember we were having this conversation and we were saying, there's a reason that they're there. They're not just there because, somebody decided to line them up. Obviously, a buyer sat down and tasted them all and found enough nuance and variation to warrant having 10 or 15 different Chablis side by side, because they are different and because they are each offering a unique proposition. And I think that's, something that I want to just kind of reiterate, because I find that a lot of times people are like, oh yeah, well, I've got a Chablis on the list, oh check, I've got a Sancerre on the list, check, and they sort of like move through, and there is more to it than that. And you can have 2, 3, 4, 5 different Chablis on the list, and they will offer different propositions. Should we taste the wines and talk about them? Because you've had such a diverse background and worked in so many different restaurants that all have very different cuisine. Typically, have you always had Chablis on your list? Actually, between Racine and Union Square and Ilili, we're talking about 3 very different places.
Yes, there's always been at least one Chablis, and in more than one example, multiple. I don't know that we ever hit 10 or 15, but there's certainly more than 5. I think at both Union Square Cafe and at Racine. And the focus of those programs, as I said, was so different that it made me a much better, more well-rounded wine professional. Chablis, to that end, offers people a great entry point to wine in a couple of different ways. One is price. The price quality ratio is excellent in Chablis, whereas it is skyrocketed in even other parts of Burgundy. And certainly it's gone up in Chablis, and you look at the top tier of producers and how they're priced, yes. But there's plenty below the top that is excellent. So there really is a Chablis for everyone. Even the ABC drinkers, which we still hear from periodically in our dining rooms, that would be anything but Chardonnay, right? So yeah. Chardonnay is such a malleable grape. It's not considered an aromatic variety. And getting to see it super, super lean and stainless steel and racy and minerally versus, with a judicious amount of oak. And there are examples of Chablis, just like everywhere else in the world, where people use too much oak, 400% new, French or American oak. But those are definitely the exceptions to the rules. For the most part, and these 3 examples are different and wonderful and really exemplify what we're talking about of what's happening in Chablis. And I'm super jazzed too at some of the newer producers that are making it stateside. We're really lucky to have the access of wine that we do in New York, and of people that do what I've just described, of gone to these trade shows, going to these regions, meeting with people, knocking on doors and vetting these wines. And you really, to bring a wine to New York that isn't good, and plenty do, is making more of a gamble over the already gamble of trying to sell your wine in one of the most competitive wine markets in the world. And so for something to be here means it really should be outstanding or very cheap. And I think that Chablis for consumers it's entering a renaissance as a place and as a place that people gravitate towards.
You brought up a couple of really good points. One is that there are, Chardonnay is planted almost, I mean, it is, I believe, the most widely planted grape variety in the world today. So clearly there is a lot of Chardonnay out there. But there is no other place in the world that can make Chablis. And to me, that's what really, one of the things I love about the place and the wines from Chablis is they present something completely unique where you really let the grape variety and the terroir come through. And it's not the heavy hand of the winemaker, which to my mind oftentimes can take over. It is a grape variety, as you said. It is not very aromatic. It's sort of a blank canvas, and it can be a blank canvas to winemaking, or it can be a blank canvas to terroir. The other thing that you sort of mentioned is that it's, it is a kind of a classic wine region. And with that, I mean, you can be in fashion, but I feel like classicism will always be in fashion. And so in a way, Chablis was not one of the super trendy wine regions, but it's never not been available. It's never not been wanted. It's never not had a place on a list. And as you were saying, you've worked in very different places at different times in your career, and Chablis has always been a link, right? So, and that to me is what makes a classic wine region. Chablis just been there doing its thing, what it does so beautifully, what it does so well, and getting better. And that's another thing that you touched on. It's the wines are just getting better and better and better and more confident. There's a self-confidence to the wines of Chablis. They're like, this is what we are. This is what we present. This is where we want to be. And they do it like nobody else can. So let's talk about the first wine. I'm actually going to bring up the label of the wine that we're tasting. So the first one is 2019, and it is J. Moreau et Fils Chablis. Just a quick note that there are a few Moreaus in the Chablis region. A lot of it, there are a lot of families operating that are related. So, but let's talk about this particular wine.
This order, I know, the people get very hung up on the way wine should be consumed, right? As a progression, as a flight over the course of a meal. And it's certainly worth considering. And there is an ideal way to order wine, but there's not just one overarching Catholic philosophy on how to do it correctly. There's a lot of ways you can approach it, whether it's by body, whether it's by acidity, whether it's by color, weight, et cetera, aromatics. And I'm super jazzed that this is how this flight ended up, because sometimes you think that how something's going to present, and then you get it in your glass and it presents one way, and then 15 minutes later it's like, wow, okay, wait, no, this is presented differently. But I say that because this example, number one, the Moreau, it really leads with this freshness, this minerality, specifically salinity, that I think people gravitate towards en masse in Chablis. So, and there's a lot you can do with that. And speaking to classicism, anybody that likes oysters and anybody that likes white wine is going to be very happy if you bring them a bottle of Chablis with oysters. There's a reason that's a tried and true pairing. But there's so much more that you can do with Chablis beyond that. You and I have tasted these wines earlier, and got to say they've been open now for 4 days, and they're absolutely delicious. I mean, they're different as they were when they were open. They're presenting just as well, but differently. And I think that for anyone considering a by the glass pour of Chablis is a very important consideration. If you were to open this and serve yourself a glass every day or two over the course of 4 or 5, you'd still be sipping really delicious wine. And a by the glass pour is a moving target, because you can't freeze wine in time. That's what makes it so attractive to age. And I think Chablis falls in that category of, it's great when it's open, it's great on release, but it also, depending on the vintage, can be really compelling in 20 years. It's not necessarily the first place people's mind go when they think age-worthy white Burgundy, but that doesn't mean that it's not age-worthy. So it's really nice to see the benefit of oxygen and time and temperature on these wines and show how well they're presenting even after the fact. But I brought that up because I failed to remember what, based on when the wines were open, I was super jazzed pairing them with, because I think that would be more interesting to note for people than kind of what they're reminding me of today. Do you remember some of the examples I was giving for this wine?
Well, I think you had a lot of nice ideas with like fatty fish.
Yeah, sushi.
And some, yeah,
Yeah,
and
right.
some sort of exotic Asian cuisine were some of the ideas that you were going with it. What I loved about that wine when I first tasted it is still there. There's kind of a, within the world of Chablis, it starts off almost with a more ample attack. There's a little bit of kind of a roundness that I'm getting in my mouth, but then, and this is something that I always get with Chablis, it's almost like you zipped it up, and that acidity just kind of like tightens that whole wine and focuses that finish with that sort of crisp, salty finish that I always love. But there's definitely notes. I mean, on the nose, I'm getting some kind of apple notes, some melony notes. I'm getting some lees notes. And this wine has spent some time on the lees. I'm just looking here. It's between 8 to 10 months on the lees. It was fermented in stainless steel.
To synthesize things from our previous conversations today and previous chats that we've had on Chablis, I at a few years ago, I loved. I'm an extremist. In my champagne, I like super linear, just like mineral water expressions, or super oxidative and rich. To bring me a champagne in the middle is a challenging mental exercise for me to kind of wrap my head around. Not to say that I don't enjoy plenty of examples in the middle, but that I gravitate towards the poles.
Okay.
And similarly, in still wines, I loved reductive white wines for a long time. For red, Syrah is one of my favorite grapes. And then I love oxidative wines.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I like white wines that are neither reductive or oxidative, but I just found myself gravitating and like being like obsessing over wines at the extremes. And what I like about Chablis, now that I've moved on from that phase in my wine appreciation, is that you have examples of the extremes, but the region is not like you're not celebrating a wine because of its reductive quality. And I think a lot of consumers, as we continue all trying to wrap our mind around what minerality is, how it presents, where it comes from, what it brings, it's hard when it's tangled up in reductiveness, right? Because like, what is this reduction? Like, is there minerality here, or is it just wine starved for oxygen? So I like these wines being a balanced example of walking that middle line, which allows more people to come to it than those that are hung up on the extremes like I used to be. And in terms of food pairing, yeah, once you triggered me when you said the sushi, like simple Japanese preparations of fatty fish with this. Oh, yes, I would like that right now.
Shall we move on to wine number 2?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. All right, so the wine number 2 that we're tasting is from Domaine de la Tour. It's a Chablis. It's also a 2019. And this particular winery, they're also doing a little bit of, as we said, typically stainless steel fermentation, right? And then they're doing a little bit of malolactic fermentation here. They are doing it, but again, not in a sensation that you'd ever get when you put your nose in the glass. What we don't have here is that sort of very leesy style. So, and it doesn't mean that they don't have some lees contact going on. It's just, I think to me, it's more notable in the other wine where it was between 8 to 10 months. Here, it's not really something that's mentioned. So what do we think this wine? To me, when I just put it on the nose, and again, it's changed a little bit from when we first tasted it. And I think your discussion about reduction is actually coming really into focus for me with this wine, because when I tasted it the first time, it was a little bit more closed and it was a little bit leaner. And now all these sort of really pretty floral notes are coming through. And I don't mean floral like, anything super aromatic, but there's a prettiness that's really come through this one. It's almost like lemon blossom, lime blossom. I'm still getting a lot of like lemony notes. It's more citrus to me than the other one, which is a little bit more on the apple and melon. Here, I'm definitely more in the citrus category, like lemon and grapefruit. And a little bit of a greenness to it, but in a like a spring grass greenness to it.
Excellent job going through the SAT there. May was my instructor on my last WSET course. So just teasing her a little
Right?
bit. But,
That's called training. It's indoctrinated into your like doom, doom, doom. So what do we think of this wine? I mean, to me, I'm definitely thinking more like, I mean, okay, this one I'm thinking more like food that I would get at Ilili maybe, or like a, like a more sort of a Greek style, even grilled fish with herb and lemon and a drizzle of olive oil and more vegetable based dishes maybe. What are your
if the first led me to Japan, then this leads me to like the Mediterranean, the Levant. And in your mind's eye, I got very saline notes on the first. I agree with your like assessment in terms of florality and citrus coming through more now, but I still retain that briny note. And the difference between like, yes, there's salt in the ocean, but the difference between like saline straight salt water versus like an olive brine with an oiliness or just olive oil, this unctuousness. And as a dirty martini drinker, I can, the wine resonates with me. I think any martini drinker with the citrusy notes as well would, at least a gin drinker would like this wine. But I want paella. I want not so fatty fish. I want more white flaky fish, and I want olives, and I want saffron, and I want we discussed sumac last time, and what a very special and heavily used spice that is in a lot of the world. And people don't know what to do things like turmeric and sumac. Like Western cooks are often like, well, yeah, it adds color. Yes, it adds color, but it also adds a lot of flavor. And I think many things in that vein would really come forward with the wine in dishes. Like, yeah, I really wish I had a big pan of paella in front of me right now.
All right, so let's move on to our third wine from Jean-Marc Brocard. So this one, we're actually going to the 2018 vintage. And also of note, this is a Vieille Vigne de Saint-Clair, so old vine. And we had kind of an interesting discussion about the value of old vines and what they bring to the table, and whether, and I do think that old vines do bring a certain depth that is to the wine, and a certain concentration to a wine that speaks of their age. And the reason I'm sort of mentioning it here is we're talking about vines that are 70 years old. So that does have an influence on the root system of the vine, the productivity of the vine, the resistance and the durability of the vine. And it will reduce yields. Yields will be reduced. I mean, that's why a lot of people uproot their vines after 25 years, because you do have a big drop in productivity. So that's a real thing. So when you decide to keep your vines 7 years old, you're also committing to knowing that they're going to be less productive, but hopefully you find value in that. So Brocard, what maybe one of the better known names, would you say, of the three wines that we're tasting today? It is also 2018. It is also the certified organic of the three. The other one was sustainable. The first one, I did not have information on it, but Brocard is EcoCert sustainable, EcoCert certified. So apologies. So again, vinification is in stainless steel, 100%, and they are spending 7 months on the lees. So this wine has actually really changed more so to me on the nose than the others.
So this is a great example of 18 after, two very challenging vintages. 18 was a nice sigh of relief. It's a great example of old vine. I think that there's absolutely value in old vine, but it's not absolute. It's not to say that things that aren't old vine are inferior. I have loved discovering people's young vine releases as well, and comparing them, to a similar plot in the same vintage and the same winemaking, and just see the one variation of vine age. Give me duck, give me like Cornish game hen, like Scottish wood pigeon, like a confit, like a duck leb. As we're moving into the fall and we start thinking of warmer weather foods, mushrooms as well. I mean, mushrooms and whether it's in a cream sauce or not, but like mushrooms and a roasted bird of some kind, or a confit bird with this wine.
But there's definitely, I'm sort of, your mushroom, when you said mushroom, that's kind of the umami is what I'm getting in this wine. I mean, it's, and when you're saying mushroom, I'm like, yes, I can really see it with poultry. And that you also, I mean, I love that you're also introducing some, because this, as you said at the beginning, Chablis and oysters, sure, right? But this is not a wine I want with oysters at all, actually. It's got, there's a depth to it, but there's a savoriness and an umami factor that's going on here that I really sort of leads me in the direction about some of those ideas that you were giving us in terms of food pairing. And I love this kind of notion of like, okay, oysters, sort of like that simplification, right? Chablis, Cameroonian, oyster. Okay.
Right. Boom, boom,
but
boom.
but there's so much more to that story. And I think between even these three wines, I don't know, it's just a small snapshot, right? We sort of went from like fatty fish and more exotic cuisine to something more sort of lean and more Mediterranean or Levant. And then we're going to this one. And now we're in, like dark meat poultry and, fall flavors. And I think that's a pretty impressive range for food pairing ideas, from a pretty impressive range of wines that we're tasting that are all from that, Chablis appellation. To me, there is still a clarity, there's a purity, there's a salinity and a minerality, even though, as we said, we're all tap dancing around that word because it's becoming more and more difficult to quantify or explain. Yet we all seem to have a sense of what that means to us. I get that. And that to me always brings me back home to Chablis. And so even those wines that have this kind of differences that we talked about, there's that common thread that I connect the dot between all of those wines, and it still takes me to this place that is Chablis. So I think, I think it's there. It's that sort of that like crispness that it's almost like the wine always finishes for me with like a little bit of a squeeze of lemon and a sprinkle of salt on my tongue.
No, that was a great description. I totally, that resonates with me a great deal, the lemon and salt. As soon as you said that, I felt it, and I never thought of it that way. But that's, it's a little kiss.
It's a little kiss, right? Well, Chris, thank you so much for this chat. Thank you for joining me on my Straight Chablis session. And I hope that you enjoyed the wines. And I look forward to coming over to Ilili, where you are now. You're still at Ilili, right? So, and I'll be coming over and tasting some of your fabulous pairings with Ilili's food and Chablis by the glass or by the bottle. By the bottle, who are we kidding? I probably won't say.
Definitely have it. Definitely have
it. A bottle of Chablis.
Right.
All right. Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye.
Cheers.